Hey guys, it's Lucy. Today I'm really excited to talk about this book. It's called Stolen Focus. This is a new book written by Johann Hari. And this guy is a journalist. So, as with all books written by journalists, this is a very easy book to follow and to read. He's fairly concise with his writing, and everything is very interesting. And his topics run the gamut. So we're just going to go through some very interesting facts. I mean, the premise of this being, stolen focus, as in our attention to focus, and the subtitle being why you can't pay attention and how to think deeply again. So I read this book 1 or 2 months ago, and it's one of those things that that came out on the shelves and it just catches your attention right away, because this is an actual problem that people seem to have and are talking about more and more, and only in increasing instances. It's just something that seems to have taken place in recent years, and something that we are all experiencing at the same time. So you could call this a social problem. And he tries to identify the problem, dissect it, and see how, if there are ways to sort of re-engineer our minds again. And there are some very interesting implications involved as well. So a lot of interesting facts and studies, and just kind of linked in here in very short chapters. I mean, if it's not clear already, I recommend everyone to read this book if you're someone who find yourself not being able to find your flow or focus as you had been maybe like a decade ago or something like that. So right off the bat, he mentions speed being something that we all crave and aspire to, especially when it comes to comprehension and reading and just getting things done in terms of productivity. So, but the thing is, various studies being quoted, more speed means less comprehension. So when we have things, these apps that are geared towards shorter messages or faster content or just shorter videos, all of that, and the recipes being spit up, like that kind of content being created, it's all not helping us grappling with the truth that if we are trying to understand something and comprehend something, especially anything that is slightly more challenging or difficult or requires more input, we cannot do it on a faster pace. It just doesn't happen. So what we end up with is a lot of easily forgettable material that is very easy to comprehend, that comes to us in these very fast forms that are sped up. So that's an issue when we are trying to work towards more challenging material. And one way to, I guess, to contend with this is to try to slow down. So hence the rise of practices like yoga and meditation. And that's just my own interpretation here. Another thing that he mentions is the cost of switching when we are, quote unquote, multitasking. That doesn't, multitasking is just us switching between tasks really fast. It's not really that possible for us to be productive on multiple tasks at the same time, consistently, like in a productive sense. So the cost to switch between one task to another, that costs us extra time. So, and that takes away from our attention to begin with as well, and it doesn't contribute to the flow that we would be trying to achieve when we are trying to comprehend something more complex, or attempting to, at least. There's a lot of interesting studies here quoted, and the studies found that the technological distraction, just getting emails and calls, caused a drop in the worker's IQ by an average of 10 points. Of course, all of this is quite out of thin air, but so at the end, it is very well indexed and cited in terms of which studies are being referenced. So I feel like if one person is interested in a particular set of studies, the author made it very easy to reference these things and check back. And when I look at a lot of these references, them being the American Journal of hypertension, or like, what is this one, the Educational Psychological Review, or Harvard University Press. All of these are credible sources that he's citing, so it kind of gives me peace of mind when I read something in the book that just studies say or studies show and things like that. Anyway, back to multitasking. Something I underlined, he nicknamed this the screw up effect. It's where your thinking is more superficial because you're not going deeper into things, because you're switching too often and too fast, and you're spending a lot of time correcting errors and backtracking. And this flows into another problem that he nicknames creativity drain, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. To try to contend with that issue, something that we could do is try to set everything aside and do what he calls monotasking, which is basically just going at one task all the way in, and don't stop and don't switch until you're done the thing that you set out to do in the first place, so that you don't suffer the switching costs when you switch back into this thing and you try to finish. So that's the part about multitasking. And then there is some very interesting blurbs about sleep, sleep deprivation specifically. So an interesting thing is adults usually respond to sleep deprivation by becoming drowsy, but kids usually respond by becoming hyperactive. This is a very interesting contrast. And when we think about hyperactivity, of course, ADHD comes to mind, and the overdiagnosis or just the prevalence of kids being diagnosed with ADHD comes to mind as well, and all of the implications. A lot of these kids being on drugs like Ritalin, Adderall, like all of these things is not ideal, and these are all short-term fixes that don't actually address any chemical issues or any physical issues. They're just sort of creating the effects that we want, which is for kids to calm down and easier to manage and perhaps pay more attention, at least superficially. But so overall sleep deprivation is contributing to the failure of us as a population to pay attention for various reasons, kind of different for adults and kids, but he talks about both in a quite interesting and summarized way in the book as well. And one interesting insight into this discussion on sleep is something where he says, in a society dominated by the values of consumer capitalism, sleep is a big problem, because if you're asleep, you're not spending money, so you're not consuming anything and you're not producing any products. That's really cold, but it's kind of true. It's not really in business interests to have well-rested people who are making very self-controlled judgments and decisions, because I'm pretty sure I've heard this earlier. People tend to shop more, in the wee hours of the night, like at the end of a really long day of work, for example. You're much more likely to make an impulse purchase online or in person or whatever than if you were, very well rested, first thing 9 a.m. in the morning type situation. So this whole sleep deprivation thing is a thing in itself. Anyway, so moving on, another interesting dot on this journey that he goes on is screen inferiority. And what this is that based on various studies, again, people understand and remember less of what they absorb on screens versus paper. And I experienced this problem myself, because since working from home, I haven't printed anything on paper, really, like myself. And I work with a lot of reports. These are things that are, just maybe like a 10-pager or a few pages that I would have printed regularly on a daily basis to read through, to edit, to do this and that, to research. And I don't print any of those anymore, and it actually causes, I find, a very real decline in my productivity because I have to scroll back, and to the point where, I would just try to recall, and if I don't really recall, then I don't scroll back because it's just so much trouble to scroll back. And when I read it through once, I don't have a particular memory of where that sentence is on a page, so it actually is harder for me to recall specific images of the key sentences or key phrases that I'm reading, key statistics. I used to have that sort of picture memory after just reading something of where those statistics are, how they looked on the page, and that's how I would extract, like how my memory recall would work. But without the hand feel, without reading it on a page, and I'm just like scrolling infinitely, I don't have that anymore, and I don't remember as much anymore. So so that's something that we can think about, that if you are reading something really, really important, maybe consider just putting it on paper, getting it on paper. And then he starts, this is now like a third of the way into the book, he starts twisting into the capitalism aspect of this, which is another sort of layer to the story, overall story and societal problem. And this, of course, we all know, the more people stare at their phones, the more money these data tech companies make. And it's become a system where our attention is being capitalized. The more time, and one specific thing that was new, that was invented, that maybe no one really ever really noticed or really liked even, is this feature called infinite scroll. This is something that a really brilliant developer came up with in recent decade or so, where at the end, once you reach the end of a news feed, for example, the page would automatically reload more items for you to go through. And this feature, infinite scroll, makes you spend about 50% more of your time on sites like Twitter. And Facebook has this too, I noticed, and various other sites, social media sites as well. That is a drain on our attention itself. And it's something that can't really be where is not really going to be changed unless there are groups calling for regulatory monitoring on these things, which is not going to happen anytime soon. He also goes into, because of the scrolling, and something called negative bias, where we spend more of our time looking at things that are more shocking and more negative when it comes to news items versus something positive and calming. So the more you scroll, it wouldn't come within the first, I suppose, time that you're going through this iteration. But suppose you go on a site, you use your personal account for a few months or even a few weeks, gradually the content would become more and more negative and extreme in terms of violence and all of that bad stuff. And it's proven. And again, this is something that is just going to suck more of your time on, because you do spend more time on negative things. So the more you look at it, the more it'll bring up negative things, and the more time you'll spend on it. So it's a loop, really. And at the end of the day, the developer says they're just selling an asymmetric knowledge about how you work, even more than you know about yourself, to the highest bidder. This being whatever internal triggers that make you as an individual spend more time on the screen, whether it be time of day, type of content, and all of that, and anything else that is related to what triggers you and what makes you tick, really. And then he goes on to talk more about ADHD and how these drugs really is a reasonable proxy for meth. I don't recall the specific chemical details being discussed, but I think that is a whole other can of worms to go into if somebody wanted to, demystify that for themselves. So at the end of the day, this is highlighting a problem that we have, and there are many pieces to this. Some of the pieces I just mentioned before, but cohesively as a story, there's a metaphor that he borrows. I think that makes sense quite a bit. So the first layer of attention being your spotlight, that is your immediate actions, and then the second layer being what he calls starlight, and that is the focus you apply to your long-term goals and objectives, and these get realized over time, but you keep reminding yourself of these, so that becomes your sort of your guidance. And then the third layer being your daylight, and that's the focus that makes it possible to realize these longer term goals. And the daylight, I think, is that layer that is being attacked most of all. And this is important because without being able to prioritize and be productive and think clearly, you would get lost. You would be just, your attention would just be stolen, kind of like the title, be stolen by whatever is trying to knock on your door. And for you to take the ownership, which is kind of like the more popular thread here, is that you have full control of your person. If you try to multitask, you try to sort of deny all of these thefts of attention, all of these distractions, it takes huge willpower, and you probably suffer a lot of switching costs, as most people is probably dealing with. They're not saying no completely to everything. They are on everything, and they are checking everything. So they're just on all the time, and they're just draining their attention. That's how our attention is being siphoned and drained in that sense. And it's an unfortunate reality for us to deal with. I feel like, again, this is like a new-ish problem that is not being helped by policies and business incentives. So I think this is a very interesting topic. So if anyone wanted a fast read on a very real problem, I think I would recommend this book very strongly. Let me know what you think, and have a good rest of your day. Bye, guys.